Most people, when they hear about a city swallowed by the sea, immediately think of Atlantis, a grand civilization vanishing beneath the waves in a single catastrophic night, more legend than history, more warning tale than verified fact. And that association has done something quietly damaging to our understanding of the ancient world, because it has trained us to treat every drowned city as mythology, every submerged ruin as exaggeration. The truth is far more remarkable and considerably more unsettling than any legend. There are real cities down there, not metaphors, not allegories, not the invention of philosophers making a point about hubris. Actual streets, temples, harbours, and homes sitting in the dark beneath the water, waiting to be found. And the stories of how they got there are stranger, more varied, and more instructive than the Atlantis myth ever managed to be. This video is about those places, the confirmed ones, the sites where archaeologists have descended with cameras and sonar equipment and come back up with evidence so concrete it leaves no room for reasonable doubt. We are talking about a span of roughly 10,000 years of human coastal history, from a Neolithic fishing village submerged off the coast of what is now Israel, to a 17th century Caribbean port that dropped into the ocean during a single terrifying morning. The cases stretch from the ancient Levant through Bronze Age Greece, Hellenistic Egypt, Roman Italy, and into the early modern world, and every single one of them is real. What makes these stories worth telling together is that they keep revealing the same brutal mechanisms at work, the same forces that have repeatedly demonstrated they have no interest in the scale or sophistication of what humans build on coastlines. Three forces in particular show up again and again across these cases, and understanding them changes the way you see every piece of coastal land on Earth. The first is the one most people underestimate because it moves too slowly to feel threatening: gradual sea level rise. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels worldwide were dramatically lower than they are today. Coastlines that are now submerged were once dry land, and the communities that built on them had no way of knowing the water was coming. The Mediterranean alone has risen roughly 16 metres since around 7,500 years ago. That is not a flood. That is a slow, relentless drowning that took centuries, that forced communities to move inland generation by generation until eventually nothing remained above the surface. This is the force that took the oldest city in this video. The second force is sudden and violent, seismic rupture, and the tsunamis it generates. Earthquakes beneath or near the sea can liquefy the ground beneath coastal settlements, collapse entire islands into the water, and send walls of ocean washing over everything that survives the initial shock. This happened in ancient Greece. It happened in Ptolemaic Egypt. It happened in the Caribbean. In one case, an earthquake measuring around magnitude 7.5 struck a port city that was already one of the most notorious places in the Western Hemisphere, and within minutes 2/3 of it had sunk beneath the sea, taking approximately 2,000 lives with it. The third force is the strangest of the three, and the least well known: volcanic subsidence, specifically a phenomenon called bradycism, where slow movement in underground volcanic systems causes the ground above to rise and fall over decades and centuries. One of Rome's most glamorous resort cities was consumed not by a single dramatic event, but by a gradual geological surrender, its villas and temples and bathhouses descending metre by metre into the sea as the volcanic field beneath them quietly shifted. Today those ruins sit up to 5 metres below the surface, preserved in extraordinary detail, and you can swim through them. Running through this video is a chronological journey that covers the full sweep of that 10,000-year story. We start at the very beginning with Atlit-Yam, a Neolithic settlement off the coast of modern Israel, a community of farmers and fishermen who built their lives on land that is now 8 to 11 metres beneath the Mediterranean. From there we move through a Bronze Age port in Greece so precisely planned it looks like it could have been drawn by a professional surveyor, then to the great temples and harbours of ancient Egypt, the pleasure villas of the Roman elite, and finally to the 17th century city that many contemporaries considered the most sinful place on earth, and which disappeared into the ocean as though to prove them right. Each of these places reveals a lost world in its own right. Each one gives archaeologists and historians a window into a society that would otherwise be invisible to us, preserved by the same water that destroyed it. But each one also carries something beyond historical fascination, because the forces that swallowed these cities have not gone anywhere. Sea levels are rising again, faster than at any point in recorded human history. Earthquakes have not stopped. Volcanic systems have not gone quiet. The coastlines of the modern world are lined with cities of extraordinary density and value, and the ancient record suggests quite clearly that building on the coast always involves a negotiation with forces that will eventually collect what they are owed. That is not meant to be a counsel of despair. Understanding how and why these cities disappeared is genuinely useful, not just as history, but as a form of warning that comes pre-equipped with specifics, exact mechanisms, exact timescales, exact patterns of vulnerability. The sea swallowed these places, but it also preserved the evidence of exactly how it happened. So let's go back 10,000 years to a community of people who had no idea the water was coming and start there. Off the coast of northern Israel, a few kilometres south of the modern city of Haifa, there is a place on the Mediterranean seabed that most people have never heard of, and that represents something genuinely extraordinary in the record of human settlement. It sits between 8 and 11 metres below the present surface, has been there for somewhere between 8,500 and 9,000 years, and was not discovered until the mid-1980s, when a storm shifted enough sand to reveal the first traces of what lay beneath. What archaeologists eventually uncovered was a complete Neolithic village, intact enough to tell us not just that people lived there, but how they lived, what they ate, what they built, and what they left behind when the water finally came. Atlit-Yam belongs to a period archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic Sea, a phase of early settled life that dates to roughly 9,200 to 8,500 years before the present, somewhere in the range of 7,200 to 6,600 BC. To put that in perspective, this community was already established before the wheel existed, before writing existed, before bronze metallurgy had been developed anywhere in the world. The people of Atlit-Yam were among the earliest generations of humans who had committed to a settled way of life, rather than following herds and seasons across the landscape. They had chosen a coast, and they had built something permanent on it. The settlement covers roughly 10 acres, which makes it a genuine village rather than a temporary camp or a seasonal gathering site. Within that space, excavations have revealed stone-built rectangular houses, the kind of permanent architecture that signals a community planning to stay. But it is the wells that may be the most striking structural find of all. Atlit-Yam contains several stone-lined wells that are among the oldest ever found anywhere on Earth. These were not improvised water sources scratched into the ground. They were carefully constructed, deliberately engineered, the kind of infrastructure you build when you expect to be drawing water from the same spot for generations. Beyond the wells and the houses, the site has produced human burials, suggesting a community with ritual practices, with ways of honouring the dead that required fixed locations and sustained remembrance. There is also a standing stone installation, a megalithic arrangement of stone set in a deliberate pattern that implies organised communal activity, possibly ceremonial, of a kind that required collective labour and shared intention. And excavations of one recently uncovered well retrieved a bone spatula and charred plant remains. the kind of mundane, accidental time capsule that tells you more about daily life than any monument ever could. Someone was processing food in that space. Someone left a tool behind and did not come back for it. The economy at Atlit-Yam was mixed in a way that speaks to genuine sophistication. Botanical and faunal analysis has identified evidence of cultivated plants, domesticated livestock, and intensive exploitation of the sea itself, fish, shellfish, and a range of marine resources drawn from the coastline immediately on their doorstep. Alongside that marine diet, the community was working with something like 100 plant species, from wild and cultivated sources combined, which suggests people who understood their local environment in exhaustive detail and were managing it deliberately rather than simply taking from it. This was not a community stumbling toward agriculture. It was a community that had already figured out how to make farming and fishing work together, how to draw from both the land and the sea in a balanced, sustainable way. They were farmers who fished and fishermen who farmed, and the combination made them resilient in ways that purely land-based or purely maritime communities were not. Material culture from the site includes flint tools, bone implements, and stone vessels, the practical equipment of people who are processing, storing, and preparing food on a daily basis. These are not exotic objects. They are the unremarkable infrastructure of ordinary life, which is precisely what makes them valuable. Extraordinary objects tell us about elites and ritual moments. Flint blades and storage vessels tell us about how everyone actually spent their time. What makes Atlit-Yam matter beyond its individual finds is its position in the broader archaeological record. It is widely regarded as the earliest known submerged settlement in the Mediterranean, not a candidate for that title, not a contested claim, but the recognized benchmark against which other submerged sites are measured. When archaeologists want to understand what sea level rise does to early coastal communities, this is where they start. When researchers model the relationship between gradual inundation and cultural displacement, Atlit-Yam is the primary data point. At the time this community was thriving, the Mediterranean coastline in this region sat roughly 1.5 kilometers further to the west than it does today. The sea level was somewhere around 16 meters lower. What is now open water was then dry land, and Atlit-Yam sat not at the edge of the ocean, but comfortably within walking distance of a shore that looked very different from the one that would eventually swallow it. The people living there were not on borrowed time in any sense they could have recognized. The coast was simply where it was. The land was solid beneath their feet. The wells held water. The fish were plentiful. There was no obvious reason to believe that any of it would end. That's the detail that makes Atlit-Yam genuinely haunting. This was not a legendary city. It was not a cautionary tale invented after the fact. It was a real shoreline community, practical, organized, well-fed, and entirely unaware that the sea was already moving toward them, one slow increment at a time. The sea did not arrive at Atlit-Yam the way a flood arrives, sudden, violent, announced by the roar of water and the collapse of walls. It came the way a tide comes in and never quite goes out. It came in increments too small for any individual to measure, too gradual for any generation to fully register, but relentless in a way that no human adaptation could ultimately outrun. Understanding what happened to Atlit-Yam requires understanding the broader context of sea level change in the early Holocene. The geological epoch that began roughly 11,500 years ago, as the last ice age released its grip on the planet. When the great ice sheets of the Pleistocene began melting in earnest, they returned billions of tons of frozen water to the world's oceans, and the result was a sustained, global rise in sea levels that played out over thousands of years. In the Mediterranean during the period when Atlit-Yam was occupied, that rise was not slow by any human standard. Early estimates suggest the sea was climbing at something in the range of 15 to 20 millimeters per year, roughly the width of a thumbnail every 12 months. That sounds modest. Across a century, it amounts to 1.5 meters. Across the span of the settlement's occupation, it was transformative. By the time the community at Atlit-Yam was approaching its end, around 7,500 years before the present, rates had slowed somewhat, perhaps 6 to 8 millimeters per year, but the cumulative effect was already massive. The coastline that had once sat 1.5 kilometers to the west was now significantly closer. The low-lying plain that the settlement occupied was being progressively reclaimed by the sea from the edges inward, and the groundwater beneath the village, which had once been fresh enough to sustain those remarkable stone-lined wells, was beginning to change. This is where the archaeological evidence becomes particularly revealing, because Atlit-Yam did not simply vanish beneath the waves all at once. The sequence of its ending can be read in the structure of the site itself. The stone-lined wells at the settlement, those carefully engineered, generationally maintained water sources, tell a story in their own stratigraphy. As the sea encroached, salt water began intruding into the freshwater aquifer beneath the village. The wells that had once been central to daily life, essential infrastructure around which the settlement was organized, became unreliable and eventually unusable as their water turned progressively saline. At some point, those same wells were repurposed as refuse pits. People began throwing their waste into structures that had once been the community's lifeline, which is one of the most eloquent details in the entire archaeological record of the site. You do not dump your rubbish into a functioning well. You only do that when the well is already lost. Radiocarbon dates taken from charcoal and seeds recovered from the site cluster around 8,100 to 7,900 years before the present, giving archaeologists a reasonably tight window for when the settlement was most actively occupied. The degradation of the wells, the salinization of the aquifer, and the eventual abandonment of the site all appear to have followed within the later part of that window, as sea level rise made the location increasingly untenable. The community did not appear to have been caught by surprise in a single catastrophic moment. The evidence suggests something harder in its own way, a prolonged grinding recognition that the place they had built their lives around was no longer viable, followed by a departure that archaeology has not yet been able to pinpoint to a specific year or even a specific decade. This distinction matters enormously because it sets Atlit-Yam apart from many of the other drowned cities that will come later in this story. Helike was swallowed in a single night. Port Royal dropped into the sea in minutes. Those were catastrophes with a before and an after, moments so sharp and total that the people who survived them could describe exactly what they had lost and when. Atlit-Yam offers no such clean narrative. Its end was environmental erosion rather than disaster, the slow withdrawal of the conditions that had made settlement there possible in the first place. The community likely moved in stages, possibly relocating inland incrementally as the water rose, carrying what they could and leaving behind what they couldn't. The village was not destroyed. It was simply outpaced by the sea. Today, Atlit-Yam lies between 8 and 12 meters beneath the Mediterranean surface, and the same coastal stretch of the Israeli shoreline has experienced approximately 21 centimeters of sea level rise in the 20th century alone. Projections for the coming decades warn of potentially a further meter of rise in the region, depending on the trajectory of global carbon emissions. The numbers are different in scale from what the Neolithic community experienced, but the underlying dynamic is identical. A coastline under sustained climate-driven pressure, with low-lying settlements caught in the path of water that is not going to stop advancing because of anything happening on the land. Archaeologists at Atlit-Yam have worked with a combination of tools to reconstruct both the settlement's occupation and its inundation timeline. Magnetometer surveys which detect anomalies in the magnetic field caused by buried archaeological features helped map the extent of the site before excavation. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from the wells and hearths provided the chronological framework. sediment analysis and the study of pollen and plant remains helped reconstruct what the local environment looked like during the settlement's occupation and what changes were underway as sea levels climbed. What emerges from all of this is not a single event to be commemorated, but a process to be understood, the kind of long, patient, unglamorous scientific work that turns sediment into story. That process of reconstruction is itself a kind of argument. Every piece of evidence that archaeologists recover from Atlit-Yam is evidence that a functioning, organized, sophisticated community once stood on land that is now underwater. It is demonstration, repeated in every study and every dive, that sea level rise is not an abstraction or a future scenario. It is something that has already happened to real people in a place we can point to on a map, with timelines we can measure and mechanisms we can trace. The community of Atlit-Yam did not choose the era in which they lived. They built what they could on the land they had, and the sea took it from them regardless. The relevance of that reality to the present moment is uncomfortable and direct. Coastal settlements across the Mediterranean and around the world are already measuring the same early warning signs that the people of Atlit-Yam could not have known to read. Saltwater intrusion into freshwater aquifers, accelerating shoreline erosion, storm surges reaching further inland than they once did. The mechanisms are the same. The question of whether the human communities in their path will prove more adaptable, more far-sighted, or simply luckier than the Neolithic villagers who preceded them is one that contemporary coastal planners are being forced to take seriously in ways that would have seemed alarmist only a few decades ago. What Atlit-Yam introduces then, and what will run as a thread through much of the rest of this story, is sea level rise as one of the primary engines of civilizational loss. Not the most dramatic engine, not the one that generates legends or catastrophe narratives, or the kind of vivid, specific horror story that gets passed down through generations. But in the long sweep of history, arguably the most consequential one. Earthquakes create ruins in an instant and leave survivors to mourn them. Sea level rise creates nothing so clean. It simply advances, and where it advances far enough, the land disappears and everything built on it disappears with it, and eventually the sea looks as though nothing was ever there at all. That is what makes the discovery of Atlit-Yam so important and so strange. It is proof that beneath the unremarkable surface of the Mediterranean, in the shallow waters off a coast that most people pass without a second thought, there are entire lives waiting to be recovered. An ancient well with its refuse, a bone spatula left in a hearth, a standing circle of stones arranged by people who built something permanent and lost it anyway. The sea erased them so thoroughly that we had no idea they were there until a storm moved the sand at the right moment and the past surfaced briefly, before the water closed over it again. The next city we're going to examine was luckier in one respect. It was found much earlier, mapped in extraordinary detail, and has told us things about the Bronze Age Mediterranean that we could not have learned any other way. But it was no more permanent in the end than the Neolithic village that preceded it by thousands of years. Off the southern coast of Greece, in the shallow blue water of Dvaraka Bay, there is a town. Not the ruins of a town, not the scattered remnants of one. A town, with streets you can trace from one end to the other, buildings whose walls still stand to recognizable height, a central plaza wide enough to imagine people gathering in it, courtyards connecting one structure to the next in the way that courtyards in functioning settlements connect the private world to the communal one. The town is called Pavlopetri, and it has been sitting 3 to 4 meters beneath the Aegean surface for roughly 3,000 years. What makes Pavlopetri extraordinary begins with its age. Ceramic evidence recovered from the site indicates continuous occupation stretching back to at least 2,800 BC, which means the community was already established and functioning more than 5,000 years ago. contemporary with the early dynastic period in Egypt, with the first stirrings of Bronze Age complexity across the eastern Mediterranean. This was not a hamlet or a seasonal camp. Over the centuries of its existence, Pavlopetri grew into a genuinely urban settlement, a place organised along lines that reflect deliberate planning rather than the organic, improvised growth of a village that simply expanded outward as its population increased. That distinction, planned versus improvised, matters more than it might initially seem. When underwater surveys began mapping Pavlopetri in earnest, what emerged from the data was something that looked unmistakably intentional. At least 15 stone buildings have been identified, several of them containing up to 12 rooms apiece, connected by streets wide enough to have served as actual thoroughfares. There is a central plaza measuring approximately 40 metres by 20, a significant open space by any Bronze Age standard, the kind of space that exists in settlements where public life is a meaningful category, where people gather for commerce, or ritual, or civic assembly. Rock-cut tombs were carved into the surrounding terrain. There appears to be a megaron, the large rectangular hall that characterises Mycenaean palatial architecture, which places Pavlopetri firmly within the cultural world of the later Bronze Age Aegean. Over 9,000 square metres of architecture were recorded during a meticulous digital survey carried out between 2009 and 2013, using three-dimensional sonar and photogrammetric techniques that produced the most comprehensive record of the site to date. What you're looking at when you look at the data from those surveys is a complete urban snapshot, a fossilised moment in the life of a Bronze Age Mediterranean town, preserved not by volcanic ash the way Pompeii was preserved, not by the dry heat of a desert the way so many Egyptian sites survived, but by the sea itself, which covered Pavlopetri so completely and so early that no later population ever built over it, no medieval village planted its foundations through the Bronze Age layers, no Roman road cut through the streets. The submergence that destroyed the settlement as a living community is the very thing that preserved it as an archaeological record. And the record it preserves is not primarily a record of palaces or temples, or the lives of elites. It is a record of the town as a functioning economic organism. Loom weights found at the site indicate that textile production was a significant industry there, the kind of workshop activity that implies not just local consumption, but surplus production for trade. Large storage jars, known as pithari, suggest the accumulation and distribution of goods, grain, oil, wine, the staple commodities that move through Bronze Age trade networks in quantities that required infrastructure to manage. Imported Cretan pottery demonstrates direct connections with Minoan culture, linking Pavlopetri into the remarkable web of exchange that characterized the Mediterranean world between roughly 2000 and 1200 BC, a world in which Mycenaean Greeks, Minoan Cretans, Egyptians, Syrians, and Cypriots were all in regular contact, trading not just goods but ideas, artistic styles, and technologies across hundreds of miles of open water. Pavlopetri was a node in that network. Its location on the southern Peloponnesian coast placed it at a natural junction between sea routes running east toward Crete and west toward the Ionian Islands and beyond. A port here was not incidental. It was strategically positioned, a place where ships could put in, goods could change hands, and the broader Bronze Age economy could function. The pithari and the loom weights and the Cretan pottery are not just interesting objects. They are evidence of Pavlopetri's participation in one of the ancient world's first genuinely international trading systems, a system sophisticated enough that its disruption, whatever caused the so-called Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC, sent shockwaves across multiple civilizations simultaneously. What is harder to determine, and what honest archaeology requires acknowledging, is precisely when and how Pavlopetri ended. The occupation of the site appears to have continued until around 1100 BC, based on the ceramic record, which places it at the very edge of the Bronze Age collapse. That still debated catastrophe that saw the Mycenaean palace economies fail, the Minoan world fade, trade networks contract, and literacy temporarily disappear from the Greek world. Whether Pavlopetri's submergence was a cause of its abandonment, a consequence of it, or simply a coincidence occurring in the same general period remains genuinely uncertain. The most widely cited estimate holds that the town was submerged around 1000 BC, likely the result of a series of local earthquakes combined with the gradual effects of rising sea levels over the preceding centuries. But it is important to be precise about what that means. This date is an inference drawn from geological and archaeological modelling, not a fixed point established by direct evidence. Some researchers have proposed instead that the town sank more gradually, in multiple episodes triggered by distinct seismic events, with a final submergence occurring as late as the early medieval period. The around 1000 BC figure has become the standard shorthand, and it may well be approximately correct, but the precise moment of final loss, whether it happened in a single dramatic rupture or across a long, slow sequence of smaller sinkings, remains an open question that the current evidence cannot definitively resolve. What is not in doubt is that Pavlopetri is genuinely underwater, genuinely ancient, and genuinely remarkable in its state of preservation. Unlike Atlit-Yam, which required careful excavation and specialist analysis to reveal the traces of the Neolithic community beneath the sediment, Pavlopetri's architecture is visible at the surface, legible, mappable, astonishing in its completeness. Divers can swim through streets that Bronze Age merchants walked. They can pass through doorways that Bronze Age families crossed every morning. The walls of buildings that once held looms and stored amphorae and housed the daily routines of ordinary people going about the work of ordinary lives are still standing, still recognizable for what they are, 3 to 4 meters below the surface of a bay where fishing boats pass overhead without awareness of what lies beneath. This is the particular gift that Pavlopetri offers to archaeology, and through archaeology to the rest of us. Helike, which we will come to shortly, was a famous and historically documented city whose submergence became the subject of ancient commentary and was probably one of the inspirations for the Atlantis legend. Thonis-Heracleion was a great harbour, a gateway to Egypt, a place of temples and royal inscriptions. These are cities with grand narratives attached to them. Pavlopetri is something different. It is a working town, a place where textiles were made and goods were stored and traded, and children grew up in 12-room houses, and civic life organised itself around a central plaza. It is evidence that the Bronze Age Mediterranean was not only a world of palaces and gods and legendary heroes, it was also a world of streets and courtyards and warehouses, of the practical infrastructure through which any real civilization actually operates. The fact that it is gone, swallowed by water that has not retreated, makes it a loss that is both ancient and somehow immediate. The streets are still there, the walls are still there. The town plan is so complete that you can read it almost the way you would read a contemporary map. Everything about Pavlopetri says, this was real, this was functioning, this was permanent in all the ways that matter to the people who build something and call it home. And then the sea came, in whatever sequence and by whatever mechanism the geological record will eventually clarify, and the permanence turned out to be conditional, the way permanence always does. The question of how quickly that end arrived, whether Pavlopetri was overwhelmed in a sudden seismic event or surrendered gradually across centuries, leads us naturally to the city that has no ambiguity whatsoever about the speed of its destruction. The ending of Pavlopetri is, in many respects, a detective story without a confession. There is no ancient account of the town going under. No historian recorded the event, no poet mourned it, no inscription commemorates the day the sea took the streets. What archaeologists have instead is geology, sediment and inference, and the discipline of distinguishing carefully between what the evidence actually shows and what it merely suggests. The first thing the evidence shows is the scale of the descent. Pavlopetri now sits between 2 and 5 meters below the surface, and geomorphological studies of the surrounding seafloor make clear that this represents a total vertical drop of roughly 4 to 5 meters since the town was occupied. That figure immediately raises a question about cause, because 4 to 5 meters is a substantial sinking, and there is more than one mechanism capable of producing it, which is precisely why researchers have spent decades arguing about which mechanism or combination of mechanisms was actually responsible. The simplest explanation, and the one most casually invoked in popular accounts, is sea level rise. The Mediterranean has been rising since the end of the last glacial maximum, and globally sea levels today are dramatically higher than they were when Pavlopetri was first built. That broad pattern is real and documented. But when researchers apply it specifically to Pavlopetri, the numbers stop fitting so neatly. The best current estimates suggest that eustatic sea level rise, the genuine global rise in ocean volume, accounts for only about 0.5 meter to 1 meter of Pavlopetri's total submergence. That leaves 3 to 4.5 meters unexplained by sea level change alone. Something else pushed the town down, or, more precisely, the land beneath the town sank. The leading explanation for that additional subsidence is tectonic. Pavlopetri sits in a geologically restless part of the world, along the convergent boundary known as the Cretan Arc, where the African tectonic plate is slowly being subducted beneath the Eurasian plate. This collision zone produces both gradual regional deformation and periodic seismic ruptures, and it appears to be the primary driver of Pavlopetri's downward movement. The average subsidence rate estimated from geomorphological data is somewhere in the range of 0.8 to 1 millimeter per century, which sounds negligible until you multiply it across 3,000 years and realize it adds up to the kind of displacement that can put a town underwater. That rate is slow enough to be significant in an important sense. It rules out a single dramatic event as the sole cause of submergence. At roughly a millimeter per century, the sinking was not something that happened on any given Tuesday. It was a process unfolding across generations, imperceptible within any individual human lifetime, accumulating across the centuries in the same way that the gradual tilting of a table would be undetectable from 1 hour to the next, but obvious after a year. No eyewitness would have experienced Pavlopetri's submergence as a single catastrophe. The town descended by increments, through a combination of slow tectonic creep and the longer-term background rise of the sea, with the shoreline encroaching gradually, the lower-lying areas becoming seasonally waterlogged, the harbour margins shifting, the isthmus that connected the settlement to the mainland narrowing, and eventually disappearing beneath the waves. The geomorphological evidence for this process is remarkably legible, if you know how to read it. Researchers working on the site have identified a series of beach rock ridges and tidal notches in the surrounding terrain, features that record successive shoreline positions as the land subsided and the sea followed it. These are not dramatic markers, they are subtle signatures in the rock, the kind of evidence that requires patient fieldwork and specialist interpretation to decode, but they tell a coherent story. The water did not rush in. It crept over hundreds of years, redefining the edge of the settlement season by season in ways that the people living there would have experienced not as a flood, but as a slow, maddening encroachment of the margin. There is one question that many people instinctively ask when they first encounter Pavlopetri, and that is whether an earthquake might have triggered a more sudden phase of sinking, a single seismic rupture that dropped the town several meters in one event, the way that earthquakes in tectonically active regions sometimes cause sudden subsidence. This is not an unreasonable hypothesis. The Cretan arc is capable of producing large earthquakes, and sudden co-seismic subsidence is a documented phenomenon elsewhere in the Aegean. But the sedimentary record at Pavlopetri, as currently understood, does not support this as the dominant story. Critically, archaeologists have found no tsunami deposit layers, no chaotic sediment signature of the kind that a seismic wave rushing across a shallow bay would leave behind. The absence of that signature does not prove that no earthquake was ever involved, but it does suggest that the submergence was not primarily the result of a single violent marine inundation. What the evidence suggests instead is a layered process. Tectonic subsidence as the dominant driver, supplemented by gradual sea level rise, playing out across a timescale measured not in hours or years but in centuries. The best current estimate is that the town was progressively flooded between approximately 1190 BC and 700 BC, with the final separation of the site from the mainland, the point at which it became a fully isolated underwater feature rather than a low-lying coastal area, occurring only much later, perhaps as late as the 14th century AD. That last date may seem startling, but it reflects the way shallow coastal geomorphology works. A partially submerged site can remain intermittently accessible, its higher points occasionally breaking the surface for a very long time before the sea claims it completely and finally. What makes Pavlopetri so valuable as an archaeological record is precisely this slow, non-catastrophic submergence, because no tsunami swept across the site, no violent wave disturbed the layout of the buildings or scattered the objects within them, because no sudden collapse buried everything in chaotic rubble. The walls settled into the seafloor largely where they stood. Because the water came gradually, the site was not stripped by the kind of energetic wave action that destroys coastal structures caught in sudden marine inundation. Add to that the protection of an eastern rock ridge that shelters the site from the strongest wave action, and you have a preservation environment that is almost absurdly favourable for a settlement this old. The shallow water, typically 2 to 4 metres, means good visibility for divers. The stone foundations are intact enough to read as architecture rather than rubble. The streets are identifiable. The courtyards are recognisable. It is, as underwater archaeological sites go, extraordinarily legible. The survey work carried out between 2009 and 2013, using high-resolution sector scan sonar and shore-based total station survey equipment, mapped more than 30,000 square metres of the underwater landscape in sufficient detail to reconstruct not just the architecture but, in part, the inundation sequence, the order in which different areas of the town would have been claimed by the advancing shoreline as subsidence continued over the centuries. This is archaeology operating at the intersection of excavation and geology, piecing together a sequence of events for which there is no written record by reading the physical environment with extraordinary precision. The picture that emerges is one that resists the dramatic framing that makes for easy storytelling. Pavlopetri did not go under in a night. It was not swallowed by a wave or buried by an eruption. It sank slowly, under forces that were real and powerful, but that operated on timescales beyond the perception of any individual generation. The people who lived in Pavlopetri's final centuries may have watched the lower streets flood more frequently with each passing decade. They may have seen the harbour conditions change, the accessible shoreline shift, the isthmus connecting them to the mainland narrow to an inconvenient crossing, and then eventually to nothing. They may have made decisions to rebuild on higher ground, to abandon outlying buildings, to relocate commerce and residence as the water encroached, without ever experiencing the dramatic rupture that we tend to associate with the word disaster. That perhaps is the most instructive thing Pavlopetri tells us. Not all cities are destroyed. Some cities are simply gradually made uninhabitable by forces that are indifferent to the human life organised within them, by slow margins shifting in ways that require constant adaptation until adaptation is no longer possible. Pavlopetri vanished through accumulation rather than catastrophe, through the patient arithmetic of millimetres adding up across millennia. The sea did not rush in to take it. It waited and crept forward, and eventually the town was gone. The contrast with what happened at Helike could hardly be more complete. Everything that was slow and incremental about Pavlopetri's end was compressed at Helike into a single winter night. Helike stood on the southern shore of the Gulf of Corinth in the northern Peloponnese, and by the 4th century BC it was one of the most consequential cities in the Achaean world. This was not a place on the margins of Greek civilization. Helike was a fully formed polis, prosperous, politically significant, and religiously important in a way that extended far beyond its own territory. It was the founding city of the Achaean League, the political confederation that bound together the cities of the northern Peloponnese, and it minted its own copper coinage in the 5th century BC, which tells you something about its economic standing. Trade moved through it. Power organised itself partly around it. But what made Helike genuinely extraordinary in the Greek world was its sanctuary. The city housed a Pan-Hellenic temple dedicated to Poseidon, one of the most revered religious sites in the entire Achaean tradition. This was not a local shrine. Greeks from across the Mediterranean world recognized the sanctuary at Helike as a place of significance, a centre of worship for the god of the sea and earthquakes whose authority, in the Greek imagination, extended over every ocean and every tremor of the earth beneath. The irony of what happened next is almost unbearable in its neatness, and the ancient world did not miss it. In the winter of 373 BC, something catastrophic happened beneath the Gulf of Corinth. The geological structure of the region, a highly active extensional rift system, where the Earth's crust is being pulled apart along a series of intersecting fault zones, had been accumulating strain for years, possibly decades. The Helike fault, running along the coastal zone, finally ruptured. The ancient sources do not give us precise timing, but they are consistent on one crucial detail. This happened at night, when the city's population was asleep, and the warning signs that might have saved them went largely unheeded in the darkness. The earthquake, estimated from geological proxies at somewhere between magnitude 5.5 and 6.0, powerful enough to produce widespread liquefaction of the saturated coastal sediments on which Helike partly sat, struck with the force that the Gulf of Corinth's fault system is capable of generating. Buildings collapsed. The ground, saturated with water from the coastal lagoon and the river delta nearby, behaved less like solid earth than like a thick liquid as the shaking induced liquefaction across large areas. But the earthquake alone was not what destroyed Helike. What destroyed Helike was what came immediately after. The seismic rupture generated a tsunami. In the enclosed geometry of the Gulf of Corinth, a body of water roughly 120 kilometers long and nowhere more than 30 kilometers wide, a tsunami behaves very differently than it does in the open ocean. There is nowhere for the energy to dissipate across deep water. The wave races toward shore with the full force of the seismic event compressed into a confined space. Ancient accounts describe the sea first withdrawing, the characteristic and terrifying drawback that precedes a tsunami's arrival, and then returning as a wall of water that swept across the coastal zone and drove inland up to 12 stadia, which translates to roughly 2 kilometers, burying what the earthquake had not already destroyed under sediment, lagoonal mud and sand. By morning, Helike was gone. Not abandoned, not damaged, not partially submerged, gone. The ancient sources are remarkably consistent on this point, and modern geophysical work has confirmed that they were not exaggerating. The destruction layer excavated at the site discovered in 2001 near Rizomailos shows a distinct 3-meter deep stratum of collapsed roof tiles, shattered pottery, and fragmented wall material, all dating to 373 BC, all buried beneath a kind of sedimentary sequence that speaks to rapid, violent inundation rather than gradual accumulation. The soil micromorphology of that layer shows evidence of liquefaction consistent with shaking at exactly the magnitude range the ancient sources imply. The shock of Helike's disappearance registered immediately and durably in the Greek imagination. Diodorus Siculus recorded the event. Strabo described how sailors could look down through the clear water of the Gulf in subsequent centuries and see the ruins of the drowned city below them. The walls, the colonnades, a bronze statue of Poseidon still standing on the seafloor, its arms raised, its trident pointed at the surface above. Whether that detail is precisely accurate, or whether it accumulated the embellishment that extraordinary stories tend to gather over time, it lodged itself in cultural memory. Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century AD, was still describing Helike as a site of profound significance, a visible reminder that cities and their certainties were subject to forces that operated on a scale utterly indifferent to human arrangement. Seneca referenced it. Ovid worked it into his poetry. For century after century, Helike functioned in the classical tradition as one of the primary examples of sudden, total, divinely administered catastrophe. The divine framing was, of course, inescapable. The god whose sanctuary Helike had hosted was Poseidon. Poseidon the earth-shaker, Poseidon the ruler of the seas, Poseidon whose dual dominion over seismic force and marine power made him, in the Greek theological imagination, the single deity most capable of precisely the destruction that had occurred. Later writers offered various explanations for why Poseidon had turned on his own city. Some pointed to a religious transgression, an insult offered to suppliants who had sought sanctuary at the temple, a violation of the sacred protection that the sanctuary was supposed to guarantee. Whether or not there was any historical basis for such accounts, the theological logic was irresistible. The god of earthquakes and tsunamis had exercised his authority over the city that had presumed to host his worship, and the result was annihilation so complete that it passed from historical event into something closer to myth almost immediately. This is one of the reasons Helike matters so much in any serious discussion of submerged cities. It occupies an unusually clear position at the intersection of documented historical catastrophe and mythological elaboration. The event was real. The destruction layer is real. The seismic and tsunami mechanism is documented by modern geophysics and confirmed by the archaeological evidence. And yet the same event fed centuries of literary and philosophical interpretation that eventually blurred into the tradition of drowned city mythology from which Plato, among others, drew when he constructed his account of Atlantis. Helike did not become Atlantis. The Platonic myth is set in a different ocean, on a different scale, for different philosophical purposes, but the cultural reservoir of ideas about divine retribution, sudden marine catastrophe, and the swallowing of prosperous civilizations that Plato was writing into was, in part, filled by events like the one that ended Helike on a winter night in 373 BC. For a long time, modern scholars were uncertain whether a distinct Bronze Age or classical city could actually be located beneath the coastal sediments of the northern Peloponnese. The site had accumulated so many layers of myth and literary allusion that separating the historical settlement from the narrative that surrounded it was genuinely difficult. The Gulf of Corinth had also changed dramatically in the intervening 2.5 millennia. Earthquakes, further sedimentation, river delta migration, and the general geological restlessness of the region had transformed the landscape to the point where the ancient shoreline bore little obvious relationship to its modern configuration. It was not until 2001, after years of systematic survey using side-scan sonar and the drilling of 99 boreholes to sample and date the subsurface stratigraphy, that researchers confirmed the location of Helike's classical destruction layer at Rizomylos, buried roughly 3 meters below the current ground surface in the coastal plain. That discovery resolved what had been one of the most tantalizing cold cases in Mediterranean archaeology. The city was real. The destruction was real. The date matched. The mechanism matched. The single night that ancient sources described, the earthquake, the tsunami, the obliteration of a prosperous polis and its famous sanctuary, left exactly the kind of physical signature in the ground that a geologist or archaeologist would expect from a violent seismic marine event of precisely that character. What Helike offers, then, is something distinct from everything that came before it in this story. Atlit-Yam vanished so slowly that its inhabitants had generations to adapt and eventually withdraw. Pavlopetri sank by millimeters across centuries, its end arriving through patient accumulation rather than violent disruption. Helike had none of that gradual warning, none of that slow encroachment that at least gave its predecessors the possibility of organized response. One night it was a functioning city, a religious centre, a mint, a seat of political power. By the following morning it existed only as rubble beneath the water, and the sea had closed over it as though it had never been there at all. The story did not end with the submergence. In some ways, that was only where it began. For the next 2.5 millennia, Helike lived on in texts, in philosophical arguments, in poets' references and geographers' footnotes. The physical city had been erased in a single night, but the idea of Helike, the prosperous, God-favoured polis swallowed whole by divine catastrophe, proved remarkably durable. Ancient writers kept returning to it. Medieval scholars inherited the references without the geography, and when the modern era produced people capable of asking where exactly the city had been, they found themselves confronted with a landscape so thoroughly reshaped by time, tectonics, and sedimentation that the question was far harder to answer than anyone initially expected. The search for Helike's physical remains runs back at least to the early 19th century, when European travellers and antiquarians began combing the northern Peloponnesian coastline for some trace of the vanished city. Francis Bouqueville looked for it. Ernst Curtius theorized about its location. Even Jacques Cousteau, whose explorations of the Mediterranean transformed underwater archaeology in the 20th century, reportedly searched the Gulf of Corinth for the ruins that ancient writers had described lying visible beneath the surface. None of them found anything conclusive. The Gulf had changed too much. The landscape above and below the waterline bore almost no resemblance to the ancient configuration described by Strabo or Pausanias. The coastline had migrated. Rivers had deposited new deltas. Earthquakes, and the Helike fault is a system that keeps generating them, had continued reshaping the terrain across every subsequent century. The sediments that buried the city in 373 BC had themselves been buried under further accumulations, so that whatever remained of Helike was not even visible on the seafloor, let alone reachable by conventional diving or exploration. The turning point came when the search shifted from inspired guesswork to systematic geoscience. In 1988, a team that would eventually be led by archaeologist Dora Katsonopoulou and physicist Stephen Sota conducted the first rigorous underwater sonar survey of the Gulf waters closest to the presumed site. They found nothing. The absence of results was itself instructive. It suggested that if the city was down there, it was buried beneath layers of sediment too deep for sonar to penetrate, or alternatively that the ancient accounts of sailors seeing ruins through clear water referred to a visibility condition that had long since been obscured by centuries of further accumulation. Either way, the underwater approach alone was not going to be enough, so the team changed its strategy entirely. Starting in 1991, they shifted to borehole drilling across the coastal plain, extracting cores of sediment that could be dated, analysed, and read like a geological archive of everything the landscape had experienced across thousands of years. By 1994, this had expanded into full land-based geophysical survey work that continued into the early 2000s, building up a subsurface map of the entire coastal zone with the kind of resolution that previous generations of researchers could not have imagined. The sediment cores told a story in layers: different materials, different dates, different depositional environments stacked on top of one another, in a sequence that recorded floods, earthquakes, sea level changes, and human occupation across the full span of the region's history. What those cores revealed was that the coastal plain near Rizomielos, a site roughly 2 kilometers inland from the modern shoreline, concealed something significant several meters below the current ground surface. When systematic excavations began in 2000, the initial trial trenches opened up a picture that dramatically expanded what anyone had expected to find. The site was not simply a classical city destroyed in a single event. It was a multi-period settlement with occupation layers running from the early Bronze Age through the classical, Hellenistic, Roman, and Byzantine periods. Helike, it turned out, had been a prosperous coastal community long before the famous sanctuary of Poseidon was established, long before the Achaean League was organised around it, long before 373 BC made it famous for its destruction. One of the most striking finds from the earliest levels was an early Helladic corridor house, a substantial structure with intact streets running alongside it, pottery still in place, storage vessels where they had been left, showing a settlement that was organised, economically active, and integrated into the broader world of Bronze Age Greece, thousands of years before the earthquake that ended its classical incarnation. Then, in 2012, the team uncovered what they had been searching for across more than 2 decades of work. Approximately 300 meters southeast of the early Helladic site, in a distinct destruction layer buried within the sediment sequence, they found it. A concentration of cobbles, collapsed wall material, roof tiles, and pottery, all dating to the classical period, all consistent with the violent disruption of a built environment in a single catastrophic event. The layer matched every detail that the ancient accounts had provided. The depth and character of the overlying sediments told the same story that Strabo and the others had recorded: rapid burial, marine inundation, the kind of depositional sequence that results when a tsunami drives across a coastal plain and deposits its load in one overwhelming pulse, rather than the slow accumulation that normally builds a sediment column over centuries. Microfaunal shells preserved within the material above the destruction layer confirmed that the ruins had been submerged for a substantial period, exactly as ancient writers described. The date matched. The mechanism matched. The location, once the reshaped coastline was properly modelled, placed the city at roughly the distance from the ancient shore that the classical sources had indicated. Everything the archaeological and geological record contained aligned with the historic accounts in a way that left almost no room for serious doubt. This was Helike, and this was what 373 BC had done to it. What makes that confirmation so compelling is not just the satisfaction of locating a lost city, though that is considerable in itself. It is the way the discovery illuminates the relationship between catastrophic reality and mythological elaboration. Strabo and Eratosthenes had described a bronze statue of Poseidon standing in a lagoon, a poros, with the outstretched arms of a deity still presiding over the watery grave of his own sanctuary city. Pausanias had written of the ruins as a perpetual monument to the power of divine retribution. These descriptions carried an obvious theological charge, and the question of how much was literal and how much was already embellished was impossible to answer from texts alone. The physical record does not resolve every detail. The bronze statue remains unconfirmed, and the precise dimensions of the lagoon that formed immediately after the inundation are still being modelled. But it does confirm that the foundational account was accurate. The catastrophe happened at the time described in the manner described. The mythological framing grew from an event that was genuinely as dramatic as the tradition claimed. That relationship between real catastrophe and cultural myth leads directly to the most famous intellectual consequence of Helike's destruction. Modern scholars, most notably Adalberto Giovannini, have argued in considerable detail that Helike's submergence was one of the primary historical events feeding the Atlantis tradition that Plato elaborated in his dialogues. Plato was writing the Timaeus and Critias within a generation of 373 BC. The event was recent, widely discussed, and had entered the cultural conversation at precisely the moment he was constructing his philosophical myth of a great island civilization swallowed by the sea as punishment for its moral and political failures. The theological structure is almost identical. A prosperous, favoured community, a divine power whose specific domain covers both the sea and seismic force, a sudden catastrophic destruction that removes the city entirely from the world of the living. Helike did not become Atlantis. Plato set his myth in the Atlantic on a civilizational scale far beyond anything in the Corinthian Gulf, for philosophical purposes that extend well beyond the commemoration of any particular disaster. But the cultural reservoir of ideas about divine punishment, sudden inundation, and the total erasure of prosperous places that Plato was drawing from was, in no small part, filled by Helike. This is the trajectory that one real catastrophe can travel. From seismic event to destruction layer to ancient text, to philosophical myth, to centuries of literary and eventually pseudoscientific elaboration. The Atlantis tradition has since accumulated so many layers of interpretation, speculation, and outright fabrication that its connection to any real historical event is essentially invisible to most people who encounter it. But strip away those accumulations and trace the tradition back to its sources, and among those sources you find an earthquake on the Helike fault in the winter of 373 BC, a tsunami crossing a coastal plain in the darkness, and a city disappearing so completely that even its ruins became the stuff of legend. And the geology has not finished with that coastline. Research published as recently as 2025 integrating archaeological and geological datasets has revealed a recurrence interval of roughly 300 years for major earthquakes on the Helike fault system. The same forces that ended the classical city have continued operating through every century since. The people who rebuilt in that landscape after each rupture, and the excavation record shows they did rebuild repeatedly across the full span of Helike's occupation, were not ignoring the danger. They were simply living, as coastal communities always have, with the knowledge that the ground beneath them held its own history, and that history was not finished yet. The ground beneath Helike kept its own calendar of destruction, running on geological time that human settlements could never fully account for. But Helike was a regional power, a polis of consequence within its corner of the Greek world, known and mourned by the civilization that built it. The city we turn to next operated on an entirely different scale, not a community whose loss echoed through philosophical dialogue and local memory, but a metropolis that processed the wealth of entire civilizations, the beating commercial heart of the ancient Mediterranean's wealthiest civilization, before a single catastrophic failure of the earth beneath it reduced all of that to silence and sediment. Before Alexandria existed, before the Ptolemies reshaped the ancient world's imagination of what a harbour city could be, there was Thonis-Heracleion. It sat at the canopic mouth of the Nile, the great western branch of the delta where the river finally surrendered to the Mediterranean, and for several centuries it was the only door through which foreign merchants, diplomats and goods were permitted to enter Egypt. Every ship crossing from the Greek world, from Phoenicia, from the wider Mediterranean basin, passed through Thonis-Heracleion first. Every cargo was inspected there, taxed there, logged there. Every foreign trader looking to access the extraordinary markets of the Nile Valley had to submit to the authority of this place before proceeding anywhere else. The city was a filter, a threshold, a toll gate standing between the Mediterranean world and everything Egypt had to offer. This role was not incidental. It was enshrined in official policy that carried the full weight of pharaonic authority. Under the decree of Seyin, formalized during the reign of Nectanebo I around 380 BCE, the Egyptian state established a formal 10% duty on imported goods. Timber, gold, silver and other high-value commodities all falling under its scope. That revenue was not simply collected for the general treasury. It was specifically directed to the Temple of Neith-in-Say, binding commercial taxation directly to religious institution in a way that made the port's function inseparable from the ceremonial and theological life of the state. Thonis-Heracleion was not merely a customs house, it was a sacred economic engine. The city's religious dimensions ran even deeper than tax policy. Dominating the island at its centre was the great temple of Amun-Gereb, a monumental complex whose scale reflected the city's importance as a pilgrimage destination as much as a trading one. The mysteries of Osiris were celebrated here, drawing worshippers and priests into the elaborate ritual life that defined Egyptian religious practice at its most intense. Later, reflecting the cultural fusion that characterizes the Ptolemaic period, a Greek sanctuary to Aphrodite was added alongside the existing Egyptian sacred architecture, creating a landscape where Mediterranean and Nilotic religious traditions existed in deliberate proximity. The colossal statue of Hapi, the god of the Nile's annual flood who personified abundance and fertility, recovered from the seafloor stands 5.4 meters tall, a figure whose dimensions alone communicate the ambition and confidence of the civilization that commissioned it. This was not a provincial outpost. This was a place that understood its own centrality and built accordingly. The archaeology bears all of this out with extraordinary vividness, because what the sea took, the sea also preserved. Surveys of the submerged site have documented more than 60 shipwrecks scattered across the harbour zone, and more than 700 anchors, a number that speaks not just to the volume of maritime traffic, but to the duration of the port's operation, layer upon layer of accumulated maritime activity compressed into the sediment like a three-dimensional archive. Among the vessels, one wreck known as Ship 17 has attracted particular scholarly attention. Its construction technique, using long wooden tenons to interlock planks without the keel framing that Greek and Roman shipbuilders used, matches precisely the description of Egyptian riverboats, the Baris, that Herodotus recorded during his visit to Egypt in the 5th century BCE. For centuries, historians had no physical evidence to test that description. Thonis-Heracleion provided it. The artifact inventory extends far beyond ships. Greek weights used in commercial transactions, Ptolemaic statues, hoplite helmets almost certainly carried by Greek mercenaries in Egyptian service, gold and silver jewellery, inscriptions in both Egyptian and Greek. The material record of the site reads like the contents of an entire civilization's most active interface with the outside world, because that is exactly what it is. The city at its height was simultaneously Egyptian and cosmopolitan, deeply traditional in its religious architecture and administrative structures, while being thoroughly integrated into the commercial networks that connected the entire ancient Mediterranean. That combination, the sacred and the commercial, the local and the international, all concentrated at a single geographic point, was precisely what made Thonis-Heracleion irreplaceable, and precisely what Alexandria eventually replaced when Alexander the Great founded his new city in 331 BCE and drew that irreplaceability westward along the coast. After Alexandria's founding, Thonis-Heracleion did not immediately collapse. Cities of that magnitude and institutional inertia do not simply stop the moment a rival appears. The port continued operating in diminished form through the early Ptolemaic period. The religious traditions maintained their momentum, the ships still came, but the political and commercial centre of gravity had shifted irrevocably toward the new city to the west, and with that shift went the patronage, the investment, and the incremental maintenance that keeps large-scale urban infrastructure from slowly succumbing to its own physical vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities in Thonis-Heracleion's case were profound in ways that nobody living in the city could have fully appreciated, because they were not visible. They were structural. They were geological. They were built into the very ground on which every temple, every warehouse, every harbour wall and merchant's quarter had been constructed. The city stood on Holocene delta sediments, the accumulated deposits of the Nile's millennia-long work of building its delta outward into the sea. These sediments are geologically recent, geologically unstable, and composed in significant part of smectite clay, a material with a particular and treacherous property. When subjected to sudden seismic shaking while saturated with water, smectite clay undergoes liquefaction. It does not break cleanly or crack in predictable ways. It behaves momentarily like a liquid, losing its bearing capacity entirely, and anything built on top of it, no matter how massive, no matter how carefully engineered, loses its foundation in the same instant. For a harbour city built on an island in the middle of a river delta, surrounded on all sides by water that kept the sediment perpetually saturated, this was not a remote theoretical risk. It was a catastrophe waiting for a trigger. And triggers, in a tectonically active region, at the edge of the African and Eurasian plates, were only ever a matter of time. The extraordinary wealth concentrated at Thonis-Heracleion, the temples and colossal statues and hundreds of ships and centuries of accumulated commercial infrastructure, all of it rested on ground that could, under the right conditions, simply stop being ground. The city's greatest strategic asset, its position at the precise point where the Nile met the Mediterranean, was inseparable from the geological instability that made that position eventually untenable. You cannot separate the harbour from the delta, and you cannot fully separate the delta from the physics of saturated sediment under seismic load. The wealth and the fragility were not opposites. They were the same thing, expressed through different lenses, and so the most important harbour in the ancient Mediterranean world had been quietly carrying its own destruction within its foundations for the entire span of its existence, accumulating colossal statues and sacred inscriptions and hundreds of ships' worth of iron anchors, all of it pressing down with increasing weight on ground that had been waiting, across centuries, for one sufficiently forceful disturbance to reveal what it was actually made of. The city that had processed the wealth of civilizations, that had stood as the threshold between Egypt and the entire Mediterranean world, that had celebrated the mysteries of Osiris within sight of Greek hoplites' helmets and foreign merchants' scales. That city had been building toward a catastrophe every day of its existence. When the trigger finally came, it did not announce itself. It simply arrived, and the ground did what saturated delta sediment under seismic shock has always done, and one of the ancient world's greatest ports ceased to exist above the waterline. What that catastrophe looked like, how it unfolded, and what it left behind in the sediment is a story that underwater archaeologists are still in the active process of reading. The evidence points toward a moment somewhere in the late Hellenistic period, most likely in the general vicinity of the late 2nd or early 1st century BCE, with some analyses converging on roughly 101 BCE as the probable time frame. though scholars continue to debate whether the submergence was concentrated in a single catastrophic event or unfolded across a more protracted sequence. What the geological and archaeological record together suggest with reasonable confidence is that the central island of Thonis-Heracleion underwent a sudden, localized ground collapse of the kind that leaves a very particular signature in the sediment, the kind that does not look like a city that gradually sank. It looks like a city that fell. The mechanism at the heart of that collapse was liquefaction, the same property of smectite-rich, water-saturated delta sediment that the previous section identified as the city's invisible structural inheritance. When seismic shaking reached sufficient intensity, the clay beneath the city temporarily ceased to behave as a solid. Bearing capacity vanished. The massive temple complexes that had been pressing their weight downward for generations suddenly had nothing to press against, and the central island did not tilt or slowly subside or give its inhabitants any graduated warning. The ground gave way, and the structures above it went with it, collapsing into the sea in what the geological evidence characterizes as a rapid, localized failure rather than a slow regional trend. It is worth being precise about what this means and what it does not mean, because the natural processes involved at Thonis-Heracleion represent a genuinely distinct combination, one that does not map neatly onto either of the more familiar modes of urban submergence we have examined elsewhere in this story. This was not Helike. At Helike, the dominant agent was a powerful earthquake, followed almost immediately by a tsunami, a double blow that struck a city built on relatively firm Achaean coastal ground and destroyed it through direct physical force, wave surge, structural collapse, inundation, arriving as a violent external event from outside the city's foundations. The destruction at Helike was seismic in origin, but the sea came in from outside. At Thonis-Heracleion, the more fundamental failure was internal. The ground itself became the instrument of destruction. The sea did not overwhelm the city from the outside so much as the city's own foundations dissolved beneath it. Nor was this the gradual, centuries-long process that erased places like Atlit-Yam, where the slow, patient arithmetic of post-glacial sea level rise eventually inundated a Neolithic settlement over spans of time that no individual generation would have experienced as crisis. Atlit-Yam's submergence was a process operating on geological timescales, a margin that crept forward imperceptibly until the settlement's abandonment was effectively forced by the progressive encroachment of a rising sea. What happened at Thonis-Heracleion's central island, by contrast, appears to have been sudden enough to trap ships in the harbour, leave artefacts where they were being used, and bury the entire urban core under metres of sand and silt before there was any meaningful opportunity for systematic recovery of the city's contents. The distinction matters because it illuminates something important about how delta environments concentrate and amplify geological risk in ways that neither pure coastal inundation nor simple seismic rupture fully captures. Thonis-Heracleion was not simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, in the way that a coastal settlement overtaken by rising seas might be. It was a city whose very success had made it more vulnerable. The Nile Delta's sediments had been subsiding slowly for centuries before the cataclysmic phase, a long-term geological process driven by the compaction and consolidation of the deep sediment column beneath the delta surface. That gradual subsidence was already lowering the city's effective elevation relative to sea level. Not dramatically, not in ways that would have registered as an immediate threat to daily life, but continuously and cumulatively, reducing the margin between the city's foundations and the water table, keeping the saturated sediment layer closer to the surface, and ensuring that the ground beneath the temples and harbours and merchant quarters remained perpetually primed for the kind of catastrophic failure that liquefaction produces. Then consider what the city had placed on top of that already subsiding, already saturated ground. The Temple of Amun-Gereb was a monumental complex by any standard of the ancient world. The colossal statues, the sacred enclosures, the harbour infrastructure capable of servicing hundreds of ships simultaneously, all of this represented an immense concentrated load pressing down on sediment that was never geologically suited to bear it over the long term. Delta environments accumulate their material through the quiet, distributed deposition of river-borne sediment over millennia. They are not designed, in any geological sense, for the weight of empires. The heavier the city grew, the deeper its foundations pressed into material that was already compacting, already losing its structural integrity at depth, already being made more vulnerable by the very success of the urban project it was supporting. Thonis-Heracleion, in this reading, was a city that contributed to its own geological instability simply by existing at the scale it existed. What the seismic trigger provided was not the cause, but the final condition. Ground shaking turned already vulnerable, already saturated sediment into something that could no longer pretend to be stable ground, and the accumulated weight of centuries of monumental construction had nowhere left to go but down. Temples that had served as the ceremonial heart of Egypt's commercial gateway collapsed into the sediment. The harbour infrastructure that had processed the tax revenues of the Ptolemaic state went with them. The ships in the harbour, dozens of them, representing the full spectrum of Mediterranean maritime technology, were caught in the event and incorporated into the same sediment layer that received everything else. And then something remarkable happened, which is that nothing else happened. The sediment closed over the ruins quickly and completely, bearing the entire collapsed urban core under several meters of sand and silt that sealed it against the oxygen and biological activity that destroy archaeological material in terrestrial environments. The city that had been building toward this catastrophe for the entire span of its existence found, in the moment of its destruction, a form of preservation that no intact city could have achieved. For roughly 1,200 years the temples stayed where they fell. The statues remained in the positions the collapse had left them. The ships retained their cargoes. The anchors stayed where they had been dropped by sailors who never returned to raise them. The Greek weights used by merchants in commercial transactions sat undisturbed in the sediment, alongside the Ptolemaic artifacts, and the sacred inscriptions and the hoplite helmets that had been there when the ground gave way. This is the paradox at the centre of Thonis-Heracleion's story, and it is one worth sitting with. The geological characteristics that made the delta environment so catastrophically unsuitable for long-term urban survival, the rapid burial, the anaerobic sediment, the completeness of the submergence, are precisely the characteristics that preserve the city's contents in a state of integrity that terrestrial archaeology almost never encounters. A city that burned, or was systematically looted, or was simply abandoned and robbed of its building materials across subsequent centuries would not have left an archive of this quality. The destruction had to be sudden enough to trap the material record before it could be dispersed, and the burial had to be thorough enough to protect it across more than a millennium of submersion. Thonis-Heracleion's catastrophe met both conditions simultaneously. What Frank Godio's team has been reading from the archive since the site's rediscovery, the shipwreck assemblages, the temple architecture, the inscriptions, the extraordinary variety of artifacts from across the Mediterranean world, represents a window into the late Ptolemaic Mediterranean that simply does not exist anywhere else in comparable completeness. The city that stood at the threshold between Egypt and the world, that processed the wealth and the faith and the commerce of an entire civilization, preserved in its destruction a record of what it had been in life, that its more fortunate successor cities, the ones that survived into later periods, largely failed to maintain. Alexandria endured and was therefore continuously modified, stripped, rebuilt, and reinterpreted across 2,000 years of subsequent history. Thonis-Heracleion fell, and in falling, kept everything. The collapse of Thonis-Heracleion was not the last time a prosperous ancient city would discover that the ground beneath a life of luxury was less stable than it appeared. Nor was it the last time that the sea would prove to be an unexpected custodian of what it consumed. Moving westward along the ancient Mediterranean coastline, we find a city whose decline into the water was slower, stranger, and shaped by forces not of the delta but of the volcano, a place where the Roman world went to enjoy exactly the kind of pleasure that Thonis-Heracleion had spent its existence taxing. If Thonis-Heracleion was the threshold through which the ancient world passed its wealth and its commerce, Baiae was where the people who owned that wealth went when they wanted to forget about it for a while. Situated on the northern shore of the Gulf of Pozzuoli, in the volcanic coastal arc southwest of Naples that the Romans called Campania Felix, the fertile land, Baiae was for several centuries the most concentrated expression of Roman luxury that money and political power could construct on a shoreline. Not a trading city, not a religious centre, not a military installation, simply a place to be rich and to be seen being rich, in the most elaborate setting that the ancient world had yet devised for that purpose. The comparison that comes most readily to modern ears is to Las Vegas, and while that analogy inevitably flattens some of the complexity, it captures something true about Baiae's essential character and its reputation among Romans who both celebrated and moralized about it. This was a place where the ordinary restraints of urban Roman life, the careful maintenance of dignitas, the performance of civic duty, the managed public face of the senatorial class, could be loosened, or at least relocated behind walls that faced the water rather than the forum. Cicero had a villa here, Julius Caesar had a villa here, the Emperor Augustus died near here, and Nero later had his mother Agrippina assassinated in the waters nearby, which gives you some indication of how completely Baiae could serve as a setting for the most extreme performances of Roman life at both ends of the moral spectrum. The physical fabric of the city matched the ambitions of its inhabitants. Villas did not merely overlook the sea from a respectful distance. They extended into it, their foundations built on wooden piles and concrete platforms that pushed the living quarters out over the water, so that the boundary between architecture and bay became deliberately blurred. The thermal springs that gave the area its original appeal had been channeled into elaborate bath complexes with heated floors, steam rooms, and swimming pools that were themselves architectural statements as much as functional facilities. Mosaics covered the floors in geometric patterns, in fish and marine creatures rendered with the particular delight that Roman mosaic artists took in depicting the world they lived beside, in mythological scenes that gave the pleasures of leisure a suitably elevated cultural frame. Marble statues populated gardens that dropped in terraces toward the water. A nymphaeum, a monumental fountain structure sacred to the water nymphs, gave the whole enterprise a religious dimension that permitted indulgence to wear the face of devotion. Theatres, arcaded walkways, dining rooms designed to catch the sea breeze in summer, Baiae had assembled, over the several centuries of its peak prosperity, an inventory of Roman sophisticated pleasure that had no equivalent anywhere else in the empire. And then slowly the ground began to move. The mechanism that would eventually swallow a substantial portion of this extraordinary place is called bradycism, and it is a phenomenon specific to volcanic regions where the movement of magma and hydrothermal fluids at depth causes the ground surface to rise and fall over timescales of years, decades, or centuries rather than the sudden, violent rupture that produces earthquakes. Baiae sits within the Campi Flegrae, the Phlegraean Fields, a large volcanic caldera system that remains geologically active to this day, and that has been slowly reshaping the topography of the northern Gulf of Pozzuoli for millennia, The name itself, derived from the Greek word for burning, tells you what the earliest Greek settlers in the region understood about the landscape they were entering. A place where the earth was warm in ways that had nothing to do with the sun, where steam rose from vents in the hillsides, where the thermal springs that would eventually attract Roman senators and emperors were expressions of an underworld that had never fully cooled. Bradycism in the Campi Flegrae works through the shifting pressure of magmatic bodies and hydrothermal systems at depth, which expand or contract as geological processes evolve beneath the surface, pushing the ground above them upward or allowing it to subside. At Baiae, the process that concerned the city's late Roman inhabitants was subsidence, the ground sinking and the sea responding by advancing over what had previously been dry land and then shallow water. By the 4th century AD, residents were noticing the signs. The sea was not dramatically storming the city the way it had stormed Helike, nor was it rising through any process perceptible in a single lifetime, the way post-glacial sea level rise had eventually overtaken Atlit-Yam. Instead, it was the ground itself that was dropping, gradually and unevenly, so that structures that had been built at the waterline found themselves partially submerged, and structures that had been built above the waterline found themselves at the waterline, and the relationship between the city's architecture and the sea that had always been Baiae's defining feature became, in the most literal sense, unmanageable. The subsidence continued across the following centuries. By approximately 650 AD, the process had largely stabilized at new equilibrium, but by that point the damage was comprehensive. Large sections of Baiae's built fabric, the villas, the bath complexes, sections of the arcaded walkways, the mosaiced floors, the marble statues in their garden settings, had descended beneath the surface of the Gulf of Pozzuoli. The city did not disappear all at once. It was not swallowed in a single catastrophic event that left survivors to describe the moment of loss. It sank incrementally, a slow negotiation between volcanic geology and Roman engineering, in which the geology was patient in a way that human institutions cannot be, and ultimately won. The people left, or moved to higher ground, or simply watched the sea claim rooms and corridors and pavements that had once been the most coveted real estate in the Roman world, until there was no longer enough city above the waterline to sustain the civic life that had made Baiae what it was. What makes Baiae so historically significant as a case of urban submergence is precisely this character: the slowness, the partiality, the prolonged negotiation rather than sudden catastrophe. At Helike, the city was gone in a night, struck down by forces of extraordinary violence that left no intermediate state between existence and erasure. At Thonis-Heracleion, the collapse was rapid enough to trap ships in the harbour and seal artefacts in sediment before they could be retrieved. Baiae's disappearance was measured in centuries, moving at the pace of geological drift, allowing the city to exist in a state of partial submergence for generations, a place where some rooms were already underwater while others were still in principle inhabitable, where the advancing waterline was a problem to be managed rather than a catastrophe to be survived. That distinction gives Baiae a particular relevance to the present moment, because it is the slowest of the mechanisms that built this story, and the one that most closely resembles the processes currently being observed along vulnerable coastlines around the world. Today, roughly half of Baiae's built-up area lies beneath the Gulf of Pozzuoli, at depths ranging from about 4 to 6 meters in most areas, and reaching as deep as 10 meters in the zones that subsided most severely, a range that reflects the uneven nature of bradyseismic movement, which does not lower an entire city uniformly, but reshapes it according to the local distribution of hydrothermal activity below. What the water preserved is extraordinary. The mosaics are still there, their tesserae still in place on floors that have not been walked on in 15 centuries. Marble columns lie where they fell. The pipes that once carried hot water through the bath complexes remain embedded in the structures they served. Many of the mosaics are still intentionally covered by a protective layer of sand to shield them from the marine bacteria that would otherwise begin the process of deterioration, a conservation strategy that uses the sea's own materials to preserve what the sea consumed. It is, when you hold all of this together, a genuinely strange kind of loss. Baiae did not burn. It was not conquered. It was not abandoned in a single season by people fleeing a sudden disaster. It was simply, gradually, incrementally, without any single moment of rupture, lowered into the water by the volcanic ground on which it had been built, and the excess of the Roman world that it had housed went with it, preserved in a blue-green twilight that the people who built those mosaic floors never anticipated would become their city's final resting place. What had been the most exclusive address in the Roman world is now, in the most literal sense, a park, and the people who visit it arrive by boat. The Parco Sommerso di Baiae covers the submerged zone of the ancient city along the northern shore of the Gulf of Pozzuoli, and it functions as one of the more unusual archaeological sites in existence. A protected marine reserve where the infrastructure of Roman luxury living sits in shallow water, accessible to scuba divers and, for those who prefer to stay dry, to glass-bottomed boats that pass slowly over the ruins at a depth shallow enough to read the details of what lies below. Roughly 10 official dive routes have been mapped through the site, each one threading between the remains of structures that were, 15 centuries ago, among the most coveted pieces of real estate on the Mediterranean coast. About 10,000 visitors experience the park each year, a number that reflects both genuine popular fascination and the deliberate restrictions that the park's management imposes on access, because the tension between opening Baiae to the world and protecting what remains of it from the world is one the site's administrators negotiate every season. The shallowness of the water is one of Baiae's most striking qualities as an archaeological site. In most areas the ruins sit between 5 and 6 meters below the surface, which is shallow enough that on a clear day, from the right angle, a visitor in a glass-bottom boat can make out mosaic patterns on floors that were laid by craftsmen working in the 1st or 2nd century AD. For a diver, the experience is more immediate still. The water in the Gulf of Pozzuoli carries enough clarity on calm days that you can fin along above a corridor wall and read the building's proportions, trace the path that servants and guests once walked, and watch the light filter down through the surface to pick out the texture of Roman opus reticulatum brickwork still holding its pattern after 15 centuries of submersion. The scale of what survives is genuinely disorienting, because you're not looking at fragments or scattered artifacts, but at buildings, structures that retain enough of their bones to be understood as the spaces they once were. The mosaics are the most celebrated survivals. One of the most intact is a long fish mosaic, its tesserae still in place, depicting the marine life of the bay, with a kind of affectionate specificity that Roman mosaic artists brought to subjects they observed daily. Fish rendered with enough accuracy that modern marine biologists have used ancient floor decorations as evidence for which species inhabited these waters in antiquity. Another mosaic, executed in the black and white geometric style common to Roman domestic and bath complex floors, rises from the sand at a slight angle where the floor it was laid on has tilted over the centuries of subsidence. Both pieces represent a technical and artistic achievement that the water has, in a perverse way, helped to conserve. The sea that consumed them also sealed them away from the exposure, looting and atmospheric deterioration that destroyed equivalent work elsewhere in the Roman world. But the relationship between seawater and preservation is considerably more complicated than that framing suggests, and archaeologists working at Baiae are careful not to describe the underwater environment simply as a protective one. Marine bacteria work steadily on organic material, on certain mineral compounds, on the grout between tesserae. The very clarity of shallow coastal water that makes the site visible to tourists also means that light penetrates deeply enough to encourage biological growth on surfaces that absolute darkness would keep sterile. The park's conservators have responded to this with a strategy that initially sounds counterintuitive. They deliberately cover most of the mosaics with a thin layer of sand. The sand acts as a physical barrier against bacterial colonization and against the mechanical disturbance that diver finwash or boat traffic can create in shallow water, while remaining soft enough to be brushed away when archaeologists want to examine or document a particular section. It is a conservation approach that uses the sea's own material, the sediment that settled over Baiae in the first place, as the primary protective agent, turning the process of burial into a tool for preservation, rather than simply treating it as damage to be undone. The site is fenced off from general maritime traffic, and only a small number of licensed operators, the dive company Subaiae being among the most established, are permitted to run tours through the underwater zones. The licensing arrangement exists because the park management recognized early that the combination of shallow depth, extraordinary visibility, and the romance of swimming through Roman ruins would attract far more visitors than the site could absorb without serious degradation. Even with strict controls in place, continuous geophysical monitoring tracks the ongoing tectonic movements of the Campi Flegrei beneath the site, because Baiae's story has not ended. The Bradyseism that lowered the city into the sea did not stop when the city finally went under, and the Phlegreian fields remain one of the most geologically dynamic volcanic systems in Europe. The ground continues to move. In recent decades, the Campi Flegrei has actually shown periods of net uplift, the surface rising rather than falling, which has its own implications for the submerged structures, since stresses applied from below can crack walls and dislodge floor sections that centuries of quiet submersion had left intact. The archaeologists who study Baiae do not have the luxury of treating the site as a stable archive. They are working with a geological system that is still in motion, and the ruins they study today may look different in 50 years. What Baiae reveals, when you hold the evidence together, is a Roman world capable of extraordinary engineering confidence, and equally extraordinary vulnerability to the forces that engineering could not ultimately control. The villa construction that pushed living spaces out over the water on concrete platforms was a statement of mastery over the coastal environment, an assertion that the sea was a setting to be managed and aestheticized rather than simply bordered. The thermal springs had been harnessed so completely that the entire social identity of the city depended on their continued reliable output. Yet those same springs were expressions of the volcanic system that would eventually betray the city's foundations. Baiae's builders were aware, in some general sense, that they were constructing on volatile ground. The Campi Flegrei's instability had been observable for centuries before the resort reached its peak development, but the response to that awareness was apparently to build more elaborately, not to build elsewhere. The confidence of wealth in a geologically unstable setting is one of the stories the site tells most clearly, and it is not a story that has become less relevant since the 1st century AD. This is also where Baiae stands most distinctly apart from the other cities that form this larger story of what the sea has taken. The contrast with Helike is almost absolute. At Helike, violence arrived in a single night, and the city was erased with the kind of totality that transforms historical events into myth, the kind of catastrophe that witnesses could describe and later generations could barely believe. At Port Royal, the earthquake and its accompanying tsunami compressed destruction into minutes, collapsing buildings into the harbour with a speed that made survival partly a matter of which street you were standing on when the ground gave way. Even Thonis-Heracleion, despite its longer dissolution, appears to have experienced at least one sudden catastrophic episode, a liquefaction event that dropped large sections of the harbour district, rapidly enough to trap ships and seal artifacts in place. Baiae offers none of that drama. It offers instead the more unsettling spectacle of prolonged incremental loss. A city watching itself disappear over generations, each decade's subsidence advancing the waterline a little further into what had been dry rooms. The process too slow to constitute a disaster in any single moment, and too relentless to be arrested by any available technology. That distinction matters beyond the purely historical, because the mechanism that took Baiae, ground subsidence in a geologically active zone, working in combination with a gradually rising sea, is a combination that appears in contemporary risk assessments for coastal cities from Naples to Jakarta. The slowness that makes Baiae's story less dramatic than Helike's is exactly what makes it more instructive, because it demonstrates that cities can be lost not through a single, catastrophic rupture, but through an accumulation of incremental changes that individually seem manageable and collectively prove overwhelming. The Roman engineers who built at Baiae were among the most technically sophisticated constructors in the ancient world, and the city they made was by any measure extraordinary. The ground took it anyway, on a timescale that outlasted institutions, outlasted political will, outlasted the empire itself. What remains is 6 meters of water above mosaic floors that still hold their patterns, and a slow drift of sand over surfaces that were meant to be walked on, waiting for someone to brush it away. The contrast that Baiae offers, slow, geological, almost polite in its pace of destruction, makes what happened at Port Royal in June of 1692 feel like something from a different category of event entirely. Where Baiae subsided over centuries, Port Royal was given minutes. But to understand what those minutes destroyed, and why the destruction was so complete, you have to understand what Port Royal had become in the decades before the ground beneath it stopped behaving like ground. Port Royal sat at the tip of the Palisadoes, a long narrow sand spit that curls out from the southeastern coast of Jamaica and defines the mouth of Kingston Harbour. The natural geography was almost absurdly generous to anyone interested in controlling Caribbean sea traffic. The harbour itself was large enough to shelter entire fleets, deep enough along the spit to accommodate the largest merchant and naval vessels of the era, and positioned directly on the routes that connected Spanish colonial ports to the Atlantic. When the English seized Jamaica from Spain in 1655, they recognised almost immediately that the location at the end of that sand spit was among the most strategically valuable pieces of real estate in the Western Hemisphere. Within a decade, Port Royal had been fortified and populated. Within 3 decades, it had become something extraordinary. By the 1680s, Port Royal was the wealthiest city in the New World, and possibly the most densely inhabited for its size anywhere in the Atlantic world. Contemporary accounts record approximately 2,000 brick dwellings, packed onto roughly 51 acres, 21 hectares, of land at the end of the spit. Population estimates vary between about 6,500 and 10,000 people, a range that reflects the difficulty of counting a population that included merchants, sailors, enslaved Africans, servants, soldiers, and a significant floating population of privateers and pirates, whose presence in the port on any given day was unpredictable. Whatever the precise figure, the density was remarkable. Houses rose 2 and 3 stories high, built from brick that had frequently been transported from England as ballast in trading ships, which tells you something about both the economics of the port and the confidence with which its builders were investing in its future. 4 goldsmiths operated in the city. 44 licensed tavern keepers served the population, a ratio of drinking establishments to residents that contemporaries noted with a mixture of admiration and horror. In 1688 alone, 213 ships visited the port. The wealth that sustained all of this had several sources, and not all of them were comfortable to acknowledge even at the time. Port Royal functioned as the commercial centre of the English Caribbean, handling the export of sugar, indigo and cacao from Jamaica's plantations while importing the manufactured goods that the plantation economy required. It served as the primary entrepot through which the English conducted what colonial administrators called forced trade with Spanish colonies, a euphemism for commerce that Spain officially prohibited, but that both parties found too profitable to suppress effectively. After 1687, Port Royal became a major hub for the sale of enslaved Africans, with the Royal African Company and private traders using the port as a distribution centre, through which human beings were bought, sold, and shipped to plantations throughout the English West Indies and beyond. The city's prosperity and the institution of slavery were not incidentally related. They were structurally the same thing. The wealth of the waterfront built directly on the lives of people who had no part in the bargain. And then there was piracy, or rather, there was the more complicated reality that the line between piracy and licensed privateering was one that the English colonial administration drew and erased according to political convenience. Port Royal's reputation as the wickedest city in the New World derived in no small part from its role as a base for privateers whose relationship to the law was perpetually negotiable. Figures like Henry Morgan, who attacked Spanish settlements across the Caribbean with official encouragement when England and Spain were in conflict, and with official condemnation when they were not, exemplified the port's essential character, a place where enormous wealth was being generated through methods that required a certain flexibility about categories. The taverns, the goldsmiths, the constant bustle of the waterfront, the money changing hands in transactions that range from entirely legitimate to deeply criminal, all of it coexisted in the same 51 acres, in the same narrow streets, in the same brick buildings where merchants and pirates sometimes shared the same table. The physical form of the city reflected its economic intensity. The waterfront was the city's central artery, lined with warehouses, counting houses, and wharves, where goods moved constantly between ships and shore. Streets ran inland from the harbour in a tight grid, and the density of construction meant that Port Royal felt and functioned more like a major European commercial city than like the small colonial outposts that characterised most of the Caribbean at the time. Visitors consistently remarked on the scale and solidity of the brick construction, on the number and quality of the shops, on the sense that this was a place of genuine urban substance, rather than a temporary settlement waiting for something more permanent to replace it. What none of those visitors seem to have fully reckoned with, and what the city's builders do not appear to have sufficiently considered, was the nature of what all of that brick and ambition was actually sitting on. The Palisado's sandspit was not bedrock. It was not even consolidated land in any meaningful geological sense. Beneath Port Royal's streets and foundations lay approximately 65 feet, around 20 metres, of water-saturated sand, accumulated over time by the same coastal processes that had built the spit itself. The sand was loose, granular, and permeated with water in a way that made it behave, under normal conditions, sufficiently like solid ground that construction and settlement could proceed without obvious consequence. Under normal conditions. The critical word, as it so often is in these stories, is normal. Saturated sand has a property that engineers today understand precisely, and that the 17th century understood only through painful experience. When subjected to sudden mechanical shock, the kind of rapid vibration that a large earthquake generates, water-saturated sand can undergo a process called liquefaction. The pressure waves pass through the ground and temporarily disrupt the grain-to-grain contact that gives the sand its structural integrity. In that disrupted state, the sand behaves not like a solid, but like a dense liquid, and anything built on its surface no longer has a stable foundation to rest on. It has, in practical terms, quicksand. Not the Hollywood version that pulls you slowly under over the course of a dramatic scene, but a real geophysical phenomenon in which ground that was solid minutes earlier has lost the mechanical properties that made it capable of supporting buildings, streets, and human beings. Port Royal was built on 65 feet of exactly the kind of material that liquefaction affects most catastrophically. The city's founders had chosen the location for its harbour, its defensibility, its strategic access to trade routes, all genuinely excellent reasons that said nothing about what would happen if a large earthquake ever ran its shockwaves through the water table beneath the sand spit. The brick houses that impressed every visitor with their solidity and permanence were solid only in the sense that the material from which they were made was solid. The substrate on which they rested was a geological condition waiting for the right trigger. By the morning of June 7th, 1692, Port Royal had been accumulating wealth, population, reputation, and structural vulnerability for nearly 4 decades. The city on that morning was, by any reasonable measure, at or near the height of its prosperity and power. Ships were in the harbour, the taverns were open, the waterfront was doing what it always did, which was move money and goods at a pace that made it one of the most commercially active places in the Atlantic world. Nothing visible indicated that the ground beneath the city was a few minutes away from ceasing, in any functional sense, to exist. The earthquake that changed everything was coming from the east, building toward a coastline that had no warning systems, no instruments, no way of knowing that the most dramatic and best documented urban sinking in the history of the Caribbean was about to provide the world with an object lesson in what happens when a wealthy, crowded, brick-built city sits on 65 feet of saturated sand and the earth decides to move. At approximately 11:43 in the morning, the shaking began. The earthquake that struck Port Royal on June 7, 1692, carried a moment magnitude of around 7.5, with a focal depth of roughly 10 kilometres, shallow enough that the full energy of the rupture translated into ground motion, with almost no attenuation before it reached the surface. For the population of Port Royal going about the business of a Tuesday morning, there would have been very little warning between the first tremor and the full violence of what followed. Witnesses described the earth moving in waves, visible undulations rolling across the sand like the surface of water disturbed by a stone, and then, almost immediately, the ground began to do something that no one who experienced it had language to adequately describe, because nothing in the collective experience of the 17th century had prepared people for what liquefaction looks like from the inside. The Reverend Emmanuel Heath, one of the survivors whose letters have preserved the most detailed account of the event, wrote that the earth opened in the space of 3 minutes, a compression of time that still communicates the speed and totality of what happened even 3 centuries later. Streets that had existed as streets a moment before were swallowed. The wharf, which had been the commercial artery of one of the wealthiest cities in the New World, disappeared into the harbour. Buildings that visitors had consistently described as solid, substantial, and permanent dropped into the liquefying sand and were either swallowed whole or collapsed as their foundations ceased to provide any support. Heath described watching people buried up to their necks in sand, not buried by falling debris, but buried by the ground rising around them as it lost its structural coherence and flowed like a thick fluid around anything it surrounded. 2/3 of the city, approximately 13 hectares, 33 acres, of Port Royal's urban fabric sank beneath the harbour in those few minutes. The scale of this is genuinely difficult to absorb. Everything that had been built on the saturated sand at the end of the palisadoes spit. The warehouses, the wharves, the counting houses, the streets, the brick dwellings 2 and 3 stories high went into the water. Some structures remained partially visible for a time, their upper stories protruding above the surface before they too descended. Others were simply gone, leaving the harbour floor as their only remaining location. Contemporary accounts mention that the water in the harbour turned white as the sand from below was agitated upward, and that ships in the harbour were briefly stranded as the harbour bottom shifted, and then refloated as the ground settled into its new configuration. The tsunami-like surge that followed compounded the destruction. The sea first withdrew, pulling back as much as 300 yards along the coast, exposing the harbour bottom in a way that must have seemed, to anyone watching, like the ocean itself was retreating in response to what had happened on land. Then it returned, a wave estimated at around 6 feet, nearly 2 meters, sweeping over the harbour and the surviving portions of the spit, carrying wreckage and bodies across what remained of the city and into the surrounding water. The surge was not the catastrophic wall of water that deep ocean tsunamis can generate, but it did not need to be. A city already in the process of sinking into liquefied ground does not require a major wave to complete the destruction that the Earth has already begun. Approximately 2,000 people died in the immediate event. As the days and weeks that followed brought disease through the surviving population, smallpox, fever, the cascading effects of contaminated water and disrupted food supply working through a community already devastated, the total death toll climbed to estimates as high as 5,000. In a city whose population at its peak may have been somewhere between 6,500 and 10,000. This was not just a catastrophe. It was, in the most literal sense, the end of Port Royal as a functioning urban entity. What survived the earthquake was subsequently damaged by fire breaking out in the ruins. What survived the fire was swept by the disease. The city that had processed more commercial traffic than almost anywhere else in the Atlantic world, that had housed 44 taverns and 4 goldsmiths, and the machinery of the English Caribbean slave trade, essentially ceased to exist within a matter of weeks. What makes Port Royal's sinking distinct from almost every other case in this story is the speed, and the speed is explained entirely by the geology. Atlit-Yam disappeared over centuries as the Mediterranean rose around it, so gradually that its inhabitants had time to leave, to build elsewhere, to carry on. Baiae sank over decades and centuries of bradyseismic subsidence, slowly enough that the Roman elite continued visiting, continued building, continued using the resort even as portions of it dropped below the waterline. Even Helike, which was destroyed in a single night, sank because the land beneath it subsided into what modern geologists believe was a fault-controlled coastal depression, a process with some geological complexity even if the timeline was catastrophic. Port Royal sank in minutes because it was built on 65 feet of water-saturated sand that responded to the shock waves of a 7.5 magnitude earthquake by undergoing almost instantaneous liquefaction. There was no process to observe, no progression to document. The ground was solid, and then it was not, and then the city was gone. The mechanism was not unusual in geological terms. Liquefaction events are well documented in seismic history. But the combination of a city of this density and wealth sitting directly on this particular substrate, subjected to this particular scale of earthquake, produced a result of devastating completeness. The eyewitness accounts that survive from June 7, 1692, give Port Royal's submergence a quality of vivid immediacy that none of the other sites in this story can match. Atlit-Yam left no written record because its inhabitants preceded writing. Pavlopetri's Bronze Age inhabitants left no narrative of what ended their city. The destruction of Helike in 373 BC was recorded by ancient historians writing after the fact, at a remove of decades or centuries. Thonis-Heracleion's collapse was so gradual, spread over so many generations, that no single account captures the moment of loss. But Port Royal went down while literate people were standing on its streets, and some of those people survived, and they wrote letters. Heath's letters describe the physical experience of the ground opening with a directness that no amount of archaeological reconstruction can replicate. He writes of houses collapsing around people in the street, of the wharves sinking into the harbour, of the water turning strange colours as the harbour bottom was disturbed. Other accounts describe watching entire streets disappear, not collapse into rubble in the way that an earthquake topples buildings onto stable ground, but sink uniformly into the sand, as if the earth were simply receiving them. The visual testimony of people who were present during a major urban liquefaction event is extraordinarily rare in historical records, and what those witnesses describe aligns with remarkable precision to what modern geophysics predicts would happen when saturated sand loses its load-bearing capacity under seismic stress. The science and the human account corroborate each other across 3 centuries. There is a pattern that connects Port Royal to every city in this story, and it is worth naming directly here. Every one of these places was built where wealth and hazard occupied the same geography. Atlit-Yam's community chose the coastal edge because the sea provided food and access to trade, accepting proximity to a shoreline that was already retreating. Helike was a prosperous, powerful polis, built on a coastal plain that its inhabitants had no reason to distrust until the night in 373 BC, when the ground beneath it dropped. Thonis-Heracleion was built on the unstable deltic sediments of the Nile's mouth, because those same river mouths were where trade concentrated and where wealth accumulated. Baiae occupied a volcanically active coastline because the same geological processes that made the ground unstable also produced the thermal springs that made the resort desirable. And Port Royal was built on a sand spit at the end of a harbour, because that sand spit commanded the most strategically and commercially valuable anchorage in the Caribbean, and because in the 17th century, nobody who was making decisions about where to build a city had any way to measure what the ground beneath it would do when the earth moved. The wickedest city in the world, that was what contemporaries called Port Royal, a judgment that mixed genuine moral condemnation of the piracy and the slave trade with something closer to awe at the sheer scale and intensity of its commercial life. When it sank, some observers interpreted the event as divine judgment, a reading that was as convenient as it was theologically questionable. The more honest interpretation is simpler. Port Royal was a city that had built its entire extraordinary existence on a foundation that was geologically incapable of surviving what the Caribbean's seismic environment was always capable of delivering. The wealth was real. The hazard was real. In the end, the hazard arrived first, and it arrived all at once. The cities in this story share something beyond their fates. Every one of them spent centuries, in some cases millennia, invisible. They were not lost in the sense of being forgotten. Ancient historians wrote about Helike, medieval traders remembered Thonis-Heracleion. The witnesses to Port Royal's sinking had barely died before the first divers went looking for what remained, but invisible in the practical sense that nobody could see them clearly enough to study them as the urban places they had actually been. Recovering what the sea had taken required more than curiosity and diving equipment. It required the development of an entirely new scientific discipline and a set of tools that did not exist until the second half of the 20th century began to make them possible. The fundamental challenge of underwater archaeology is not depth. Most of the sites in this story sit in relatively shallow water. Atlit-Yam between 8 and 11 metres, Thonis-Heracleion at roughly 10, Pavlopetri at just 3 to 5. The challenge is visibility and sediment and the extraordinary fragility of structures that have been chemically and physically altered by centuries of submersion. The Mediterranean and the Nile Delta are not clear Caribbean waters. At Atlit-Yam and at sites in similarly turbid coastal environments, divers routinely work in conditions where visibility drops to half a metre or less, enough to see the object directly in front of you, but not enough to understand its spatial relationship to anything else. Doing archaeology in those conditions using only direct observation would be like trying to map a cathedral by feeling individual stones while blindfolded, and describing each one individually, without any way to understand how they fit together into a whole. This is why the revolution in underwater archaeology was technological before it was interpretive. The tools that changed everything were geophysical, instruments capable of sensing what was beneath the seafloor without requiring a diver to see it directly. Sonar in its various forms became the starting point. Multi-beam bathymetry produces detailed three-dimensional maps of the seafloor itself, revealing irregularities in the bottom topography that might indicate buried structures. Side-scan sonar sweeps the seafloor with acoustic signals and produces high-resolution images that show the texture and composition of the bottom in ways that can distinguish between natural sediment formations and the regular, angular geometries that human construction tends to produce. Sub-bottom profilers send acoustic pulses deeper, below the sediment surface, and return data about what lies buried. Walls, floors, the wooden foundations that Thonis-Heracleion's builders drove into the Nile Delta mud 2.5 millennia ago. But sonar alone cannot locate every kind of structure, and this is where magnetometers transform the field. Stone and ceramic do not generate magnetic signals. Metal does, and so does fired material like hearths and kilns, and so, under the right conditions, do the concentrations of iron-bearing minerals that human activity tends to deposit and disturb. A magnetometer survey of an ancient site can reveal the invisible shape of a settlement through the magnetic signature of what its inhabitants left behind. At Atlit-Yam, a team conducting a high-resolution marine magnetic survey used a potassium vapor magnetometer and gradiometer deployed on a 0.5-meter grid with satellite-based differential GPS, providing sub-meter positioning accuracy throughout. The result was a map of 59 distinct magnetic anomalies across the site, irregularities in the magnetic field that pointed directly at stone-lined wells, megalithic structures, and the buried remnants of a community that had been underwater for more than 7,000 years. Each anomaly was then verified by divers, who descended to the targets the magnetometer had identified and confirmed what the instruments had predicted was there. The magnetic survey did not replace the diving. It directed it, transforming the search from an open-ended exploration into a systematic investigation of known targets. At Thonis-Heracleion, the scale of the challenge demanded a more comprehensive approach. The Institut Européen d'Archéologie Sous-Marine, led by Frank Gaudiot, deployed a combination of multi-beam bathymetry, side-scan sonar, sub-bottom profiling, a nuclear magnetic resonance magnetometer, and satellite positioning to survey an area covering 11 by 15 kilometers at around 10 meters depth. The geophysical survey mapped an entire drowned landscape, the course of ancient canals, the locations of temples, the positions of harbour infrastructure, before a single systematic excavation began. When the team then moved in with divers and excavation equipment, they were not searching. They were investigating a site whose general layout they already understood from the instruments, cross-checking geophysical signatures against the physical reality of what lay in the sediment. That combination of approaches is what allowed Gaudiot's team to recover not just individual objects, though the statues, the gold, the ceramics, and the more than 100 shipwrecks are extraordinary, but the urban logic of Thonis-Heracleion as a functioning city, the way its canals connected to its harbour, the relationship between the Temple of the Moon and the commercial infrastructure that surrounded it. The most recent work at Thonis-Heracleion has continued to refine and extend this picture. New scanning technology has revealed structures that earlier surveys missed, including evidence that allows researchers to better understand the catastrophic liquefaction event that brought the city down around 150 BC. The wooden beams driven into the Nile Delta sediment as foundations, now preserved and mappable, the spatial pattern of collapse that the sub-bottom profilers can trace through the layers of mud that buried everything so completely that the city was genuinely unknown to modern scholarship until Goddio's survey began in the 1990s. There is a third tool that has transformed the field more recently, and it addresses the problem that geophysical survey cannot fully solve, the problem of what something actually looks like. Three-dimensional photogrammetry, the technique of building accurate three-dimensional models from overlapping photographs, has made it possible to create detailed digital records of underwater sites, even under the visibility conditions that make direct observations so limited. The process requires careful systematic photography, a diver or a remotely operated vehicle moving through a site capturing thousands of overlapping images, which are then processed by software that calculates the three-dimensional position of every identifiable point and assembles them into a complete spatial model. In environments where visibility is below a meter, this requires extraordinarily methodical work, and the resulting models must be cross-referenced with sonar and sub-bottom data to produce a complete picture. But the end product is a spatially accurate representation of an ancient site that can be studied, measured, and compared against known architectural patterns without a researcher needing to be physically present underwater. That last point matters more than it might seem, because it bears directly on the question of how archaeologists distinguish genuine urban remains from what the field bluntly calls wishful interpretation. When a site exists only as a series of diving observations recorded individually by different people on different days with different conditions, there is real scope for misreading. Irregular natural rock formations can look like walls to someone who wants to find walls. When that same site is mapped geophysically, modelled photogrammetrically, and cross-referenced against multiple independent data sources, the architectural patterns that emerge either match what human construction produces, the right angles, the consistent coursing of stonework, the regularity of spatial organisation, or they do not. Sites that survive that level of scrutiny, as Atlit-Yam and Thonis-Heracleion and Pavlopetri have, are genuinely urban remains. Sites that fail to survive it, that look compelling in diving photographs and dissolve into ambiguity under geophysical examination, tend to reveal themselves as natural formations that were read through the lens of someone's prior conviction. This methodological discipline is the difference between history and myth, and it is worth holding on to as this story approaches its end. Every site examined so far has earned its place through exactly this kind of evidence: geological data, archaeological excavation, historical documentation, and geophysical survey that collectively support the same conclusions. The cultures that built Atlit-Yam, Pavlopetri, Helike, Thonis-Heracleion, Baiae, and Port Royal were real. The processes that drowned them were real, the tools that found them are real, and the discipline with which they were applied is what allows us to say with confidence what happened and what was lost. That discipline also creates a very clear boundary. On one side of it are the drowned cities of genuine history. On the other side is something quite different, a legend so powerful and so persistent that it has shaped the way people think about lost civilizations for more than 2,000 years, absorbing genuine archaeological discoveries into its mythology, and resisting every attempt to test it against the kind of evidence that actually survives. That boundary, and what lies on the wrong side of it, is where this story ends. The legend is Atlantis, and it begins with a philosopher, not an explorer. Plato introduced the story in two dialogues written around 360 BC. A technologically advanced island civilization, larger than Libya and Asia combined, swallowed by the sea in a single day and night of catastrophic destruction. He attributed the account to Egyptian priests who had supposedly preserved knowledge that Greek memory had lost. Scholars have debated ever since whether Plato was recording a genuine tradition, constructing a political allegory, or doing something in between. What we can say with confidence is this: by the time Plato was writing, the Mediterranean world already had real drowned cities in its recent memory. Helike had vanished beneath the Corinthian Gulf just 13 years before Plato completed his dialogues. Ancient writers made the connection explicitly. The sudden, total, catastrophic nature of Helike's destruction. A prosperous Achaean city gone in a single night, its temples and citizens dragged under by earthquake and tsunami, mapped so directly onto the Atlantis story that ancient commentators cited it as the model. Plato may or may not have been drawing on Helike directly, but the idea that a wealthy, connected, coastal civilization could be swallowed whole without warning in a single catastrophic event was not fantasy in 4th century Greece. It was recent news. Thonis-Heracleion adds a further layer to this picture. Egypt's primary harbour, a city of temples and warehouses and hundreds of vessels, collapsed around 150 BC when the Nile Delta sediment beneath it liquefied, and a tsunami did the rest. The city that had processed much of the trade between the Mediterranean world and the Nile Valley simply ceased to exist at the surface. And Baiae, the resort city of Rome's wealthier citizens, did not disappear in a single night, but sank so gradually through bradyseismic subsidence that successive generations watched their coastline retreating, their harbours deepening, their villas sliding underwater, a slow-motion version of the same loss, earning it the description that still attaches to it today. A real-life Atlantis. 3 different mechanisms, 3 different timescales, 3 different cultures, and all of them feeding the same persistent human conviction that there are drowned worlds beneath the sea that once matched or exceeded what we have built since. That conviction has generated claims that deserve to be treated carefully. Dvaraka, the legendary city said in Hindu tradition to have been the kingdom of Krishna, has been the subject of underwater investigations in the Gulf of Kambat off India's coast. Those excavations have found structures and artifacts in shallow coastal waters, and the site is genuinely being studied, but the archaeological evidence remains ambiguous and the interpretations are disputed among scholars. The dating is contested, the identification with the legendary Dvaraka is unproven, and the finds have not yet survived the level of independent scrutiny that would allow confident conclusions. The Yonaguni monument off the coast of Japan presents a different kind of ambiguity. Dramatic stepped formations on the seafloor that photographs make look convincingly architectural. Geologists who have examined the site in detail have concluded that the structures are natural sandstone formations, shaped by the fracture patterns inherent in the rock rather than by human hands. They are striking, but striking natural formations are exactly the kind of thing that the methodological discipline described throughout this story exists to distinguish from genuine urban remains. Neither Dvaraka nor Yonaguni belongs in the same category as Atlit-Yam, Pavlopetri or Thonis-Heracleion. They are cautionary reminders that the desire to find lost civilizations is powerful enough to shape what we think we see. Which brings this story back to the 3 forces that have done the actual work of swallowing cities throughout the 10,000 years covered here. Seismic rupture and the tsunamis that follow from it destroyed Helike, catastrophically accelerated the end of Thonis-Heracleion, and killed 2,000 people in Port Royal in a matter of minutes. Gradual sea level rise, operating over centuries and millennia, submerged Atlit-Yam and Pavlopetri so slowly that their populations had time to abandon them and move to higher ground, leaving the settlements empty before the sea arrived. Bradyseismic subsidence in volcanically active terrain pulled Baiae beneath the water incrementally in a process still ongoing today. These are not ancient forces that operated only in a more geologically active past. They are active now. They are measurable now. And in at least one of these 3 categories they are accelerating. Sea level rise driven by climate change is a documented, measured reality. The rate of rise observed over the 20th and 21st centuries already exceeds the background rate at which Mediterranean levels climbed in the millennia after Atlit-Yam's abandonment. The settlements most vulnerable to what is coming are, almost without exception, the same kinds of places that have always been most vulnerable. Low-lying coastal communities built on deltaic sediments, on subsiding volcanic terrain, or simply at elevations that made sense when they were founded but are now within the margin of storm surge and incremental inundation. Alexandria sits on the edge of the same Nile delta that swallowed Thonis-Heracleion. Coastal cities across South and Southeast Asia are subsiding under their own weight, while the sea around them rises. The combination of gradual inundation and acute seismic risk has not changed. The number of people living within its reach has increased by orders of magnitude. The drowned cities in this story are not relics of a world so different from our own that their fates feel remote. They are the record of what the same forces that are operating today have done before, preserved in the sediment with a precision that modern technology can now read clearly enough to understand. Atlit-Yam is not a myth. Helike is not a myth. Thonis-Heracleion is not a myth. They are data points, extraordinarily vivid, extraordinarily well-preserved data points, about what coastlines do to the civilizations that trust them too completely. That the sea has done this before is not a reason for despair. It is a reason to pay attention to exactly the kind of evidence that underwater archaeology has spent half a century learning to recover,